Welcome to Crime Documentary, where shadows of the past still whisper and the darkest crimes remain unsolved. Tonight we dive into one of the most chilling mysteries in American history, a case that has baffled investigators, terrified communities, and captivated the world for decades: the Zodiac Killer. A man who didn't just kill but toyed with the police and the press, sending cryptic letters and codes that remain unsolved to this very day. A story of fear, taunting, and a puzzle that still haunts America. This isn't just a case file, it's a nightmare written in blood and code. It began in the late 1960s, when California was alive with freedom, music, and revolution. The air charged with youth rebellion and dreams of a brighter tomorrow. San Francisco and its surrounding areas were filled with flower children marching to the sound of guitars and peace chants. But under the glowing haze of love and protest, something far darker was moving in silence. A man whose face no one truly saw, but whose presence would soon carve fear into the heart of America, stalked the innocent. The Zodiac was not merely a killer, he was a phantom, a mind that found joy not in blood alone, but in power and control, in watching entire communities shiver at the sound of his name. The first signs came without warning, no one expecting the storm that was about to consume Northern California. On a July night in 1969, two teenagers parked on a quiet lover's lane became the target of something that had no name yet. They thought the night was theirs alone under the stars, sharing whispers and glances, when suddenly headlights pierced the darkness. What came next was violence so swift, so merciless that it shocked investigators to their core. The killer struck with precision, his movements not the frenzy of madness, but the calm of someone who knew exactly what he wanted to do. When he left, he didn't just leave bodies, he left terror. Within hours the story began to spread, but no one realized it was only the beginning. Unlike most killers who tried to hide from the police, this man wanted attention. He demanded it. He called authorities himself, boasting of his crimes with chilling calmness, as if he were proud of the horror he created. But he wasn't satisfied with being just another name on a police blotter. He wanted to be unforgettable. And that's when the letters began. The first envelopes arrived at local newspapers, and their contents would change everything. Inside were not only admissions of guilt, but puzzles, taunts written with arrogance. The killer wanted his words printed on the front pages for all to see. He wanted fear to spread like wildfire. These letters contained strange codes, bizarre symbols, and sentences that dripped with cruelty. At the bottom of each letter was his mark, a crosshair-like circle that would become his terrifying signature. In that moment, he became something more than a murderer. He became the Zodiac. Couples across California suddenly felt the weight of paranoia pressing down on them. Lovers' lanes, once places of secrecy and romance, turned into hunting grounds in the imagination of the public. Parents warned their children not to wander after dark. Newspapers fueled the panic by printing his words exactly as he demanded, because the fear of not printing them was greater. This killer had flipped the game. He wasn't hiding from the police, he was controlling them. He was controlling the media. He was controlling the people. For investigators, the shock came not only from the brutality of his crimes, but from the way he seemed to treat murder as just one part of his game. The letters mocked them as if they were pawns in a deadly chess match. The codes were another weapon he used to keep himself alive in their minds. Even before the name Zodiac spread across the country, he was already inside the minds of every detective who read his words and every family who feared being next. The case quickly became more than just a homicide investigation. It became psychological warfare. California in those years was a strange mix of light and darkness. On one side was peace music festivals, gatherings of love and hope. On the other side was this faceless killer turning those same streets into shadows of fear. The Zodiac had an uncanny ability to strike where people felt most vulnerable. Lovers in parked cars, victims who thought they were alone and safe, the places meant for intimacy and trust, twisted into crime scenes. Every attack carried the same feeling of cold calculation. He was not reckless. He was deliberate. He wanted people to talk about him, and he succeeded. When police officers responded to the scenes, they were haunted not just by the blood, but by the silence left behind. There were no fingerprints, no clear evidence, nothing they could use to pin down who this man really was. He vanished into the night like smoke, leaving only questions behind. Witness descriptions were vague, contradictory at times. Some saw a stocky man, others swore he was taller. Some said glasses, some said no glasses. It was as though the Zodiac himself enjoyed being blurry, as if his greatest disguise was confusion itself. The letters kept coming, each one stranger and more chilling than the last. In them he didn't just claim his killings, he threatened more. He demanded his puzzles be solved and warned of new violence. If they weren't, to many it seemed like a cruel game, but to him it was everything. He wanted recognition. He wanted to be feared. And he knew the power of mystery was stronger than the power of the knife or the gun. By leaving questions he created legends, and legends never die. For the families of his victims, grief was made heavier by the way the killer made their pain part of his theater. Their loss was printed in newspapers not only as tragedy, but as part of a larger stage where the Zodiac played the lead role. Each new murder was not just a killing, it was a message. He had made himself impossible to ignore. Communities braced themselves every time another letter arrived, and police stations were flooded with tips, most of them leading nowhere. Everyone thought they saw him. Everyone believed they knew someone who could be him. The paranoia was as deadly as the crimes themselves. Even seasoned detectives who had dealt with killers before admitted they had never seen anything like this. Most killers avoided the spotlight, but the Zodiac thrived in it. His crimes were brutal, but what made him truly terrifying was the way he stretched the violence beyond the crime scene. He forced the entire state to live inside his nightmare. He created a character that was bigger than himself and fed on the fear of millions. No one could look at the strange symbol he left without feeling a chill in their spine. In those early days before the Zodiac name was etched into history, no one knew exactly what they were dealing with. Was he a lone madman obsessed with puzzles? Or was he something far worse, a mind playing with the entire system to prove he could not be caught? The crimes left bodies behind, but the words left scars across America. Every letter was like a blade cutting through trust, cutting through safety, cutting through the idea that killers could be easily caught and punished. He was different. He was calculating. He was invisible. The letters were unlike anything the police had ever seen, each one dripping with arrogance and menace, as though the writer was savoring the chaos he created. They weren't simple confessions or vague threats. These were carefully crafted puzzles designed to confuse, to taunt, and to terrify. When the first letters landed on the desks of editors, they demanded attention. They had to be printed in newspapers, the killer insisted, and he promised more bloodshed if his orders were not followed. It was a demand that no editor or law enforcement official could ignore, because behind the threat was the knowledge that this man had already killed, and he would do it again. And so the words of a murderer appeared in black ink on the morning papers for the world to read. The codes were a strange mixture of symbols, numbers, and letters stitched together in ways that seemed unbreakable. The killer claimed that hidden inside his puzzles was his identity, that if someone could solve them, they would know who he was. This was not just murder, this was theater, and the public was forced to be the audience. Experts scrambled, cryptographers, professors, even ordinary citizens sat at their tables with newspapers spread out, trying desperately to crack the strange patterns. Families who had once opened the paper for sports scores and daily news now found themselves staring into the eyes of madness disguised as ciphers. Within days, the Zodiac was no longer just a killer on the loose. He was a phantom with a voice that reached into every living room. America had never seen anything quite like it. The idea of a man not only killing but writing to the world about it, and then daring people to stop him, was something out of a nightmare. The fear was immediate and heavy. Parents began locking doors earlier couples avoided. Secluded roads and every dark street corner felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. The Zodiac had not only murdered lives, he had murdered peace of mind. Each new letter deepened the terror. He mocked the police for their failures, ridiculed investigators for chasing dead ends, and treated the murders as if they were points on a scorecard. He described his victims in chilling detail, reliving the crimes with an almost playful cruelty. His tone was casual, at times almost conversational, as if he were writing to an old friend rather than confessing to acts of horror. He called himself the Zodiac as if the name were a brand, something he could carve into the public consciousness forever. The name stuck. With every printed letter, the symbol of the crosshair burned itself into the American psyche, becoming a mark of dread. The effect on society was overwhelming. In California, people lived under a cloud of fear that seemed impossible to escape. Newspapers sold out quickly as citizens rushed to read the latest message. Radio stations discussed the killer's words endlessly. He had succeeded in what he craved most: attention. He wasn't just a faceless predator in the night anymore. He was a looming figure who had taken control of the narrative. He dictated. When the papers printed his letters, he dictated how the police responded, and he dictated how families lived their daily lives. In his mind, he was in complete control. Every time the mail arrived at a newsroom, hands trembled before the envelopes were opened. Editors and journalists knew they weren't handling ordinary correspondence, but the thoughts of a man who thrived on destruction. Some letters included threats against schools, claiming he would shoot children if his puzzles weren't published. Others boasted about killings yet to be connected to him, daring the police to find the truth. The fear spread like an infection, not just because of what he did, but because of what he promised to do. No one knew when or where he would strike again. For the police, it was maddening. They were trained to investigate crimes with evidence, fingerprints, DNA, witnesses, but here was a killer who left behind none of those things, only words and codes. How could they catch someone who seemed to vanish like smoke and only reappear through the pages of a newspaper? Detectives pored over his writings, trying to decipher his mind, searching for mistakes, searching for slips of humanity hidden between the lines. But the Zodiac seemed to delight in their struggle. Every unsolved puzzle, every dead end was his victory. The nation became obsessed. Ordinary people became amateur codebreakers, sitting up late at night with pencils and notebooks, convinced they might be the one to solve the mystery. Couples who once strolled peacefully through parks now glanced over their shoulders, suspicious of every shadow. The Zodiac had turned daily life into a stage for his performance. He thrived on the whispers, on the fear that lingered when the sun went down. It was no longer about the crimes themselves. It was about the story he created, the story he controlled. Even beyond California, his legend spread. National news outlets picked up the story, running headlines that carried his name from coast to coast. Americans who had never heard of Vallejo or Lake Berryessa suddenly knew those places as sites of terror. The Zodiac had achieved something even the most notorious killers rarely did. He made himself a household name while still managing to remain invisible. The combination of anonymity and arrogance made him larger than life. He was a ghost who wrote letters, a shadow that spoke louder than any face. The police departments across different counties were forced to work together, but even then the Zodiac seemed to enjoy exploiting their weaknesses. He killed in one jurisdiction, then sent letters to another, forcing law enforcement to argue about who had control of the case. He knew exactly how to sow division. Each jurisdictional dispute meant more time wasted and more chances for him to remain untouchable. The Zodiac wasn't just playing with codes, he was playing with the system itself. His words were not only terrifying, they were manipulative. He told the world he was building a collection of slaves for the afterlife, describing his victims not as human beings but as possessions. He painted himself as something beyond mortal, a force destined to live on forever. And in a twisted way he was right. Every letter added to his myth, every puzzle kept him alive in the minds of millions. Even those who feared him couldn't resist reading his words. He had trapped an entire nation in his web, and every time the papers published his cryptic symbols, he tightened the strands a little more. In living rooms across America, people debated whether the codes could really be solved, whether the killer had truly hidden his identity in plain sight, or whether it was just another trick. Families whispered his name over dinner tables, children repeated his threats in schoolyards, and adults avoided secluded places after dark. The Zodiac had become more than a murderer. He was now a force that dictated behavior, controlled fear, and reshaped the very way people lived their lives. His letters weren't just communications, they were weapons sharper than knives, bullets, or ropes. They cut deeper into the soul of a community than any blade ever could. Detectives worked tirelessly chasing shadows through fog-filled streets and dusty archives, trying to piece together the fragments of a man who seemed to exist only in the spaces between crimes and letters. The task was unlike anything they had faced before, because there was no ordinary trail to follow. Every case file thickened with reports, photographs, interviews, and sketches, but none of it ever connected into something solid. Each time they thought they had found a breakthrough, the evidence dissolved, like smoke slipping through their fingers, leaving behind only frustration and sleepless nights. The investigation stretched across multiple counties, forcing agencies to work together, but instead of unity, the Zodiac exploited the cracks in their system. Killings happened in one jurisdiction, letters were mailed from another, and suspicion traveled everywhere. Law enforcement officers argued about theories and suspects, each department guarding their own information, as if solving the case would bring glory to them alone. The Zodiac seemed to thrive on this chaos, as though he knew he could stay free, simply because the people hunting him were too divided. He was always one step ahead, leaving behind only riddles while the police tripped over one another chasing ghosts. One suspect rose above the rest, and for years his name became nearly synonymous with the Zodiac. Arthur Lee Allen, a man with a dark history, a strange personality, and a trail of circumstances that made him a perfect candidate. He was known to be interested in ciphers, had strange obsessions, and fit witness descriptions in unsettling ways. Investigators poured their efforts into him, questioning him, relentlessly searching his home, gathering every shred of evidence that could connect him to the murders. People who knew him whispered about odd behaviors, strange conversations, eerie coincidences that painted him in darker and darker shades. Yet no matter how many times they circled back to Allen, the case against him refused to close. The evidence never matched perfectly, the fingerprints were wrong, the DNA inconclusive, the handwriting not definitive. It was as if the universe itself refused to give them the one piece they needed to lock him away. For detectives, this became maddening. They would stare at photographs of Allen, compare his life to the timeline of the murders, and feel the crushing weight of possibility. What if he was the one, and they simply lacked the proof? What if the killer sat in their interrogation room answering questions, with a smirk, knowing full well he was untouchable? The frustration cut deep, because if Allen wasn't the Zodiac, then who was? How many other suspects had slipped through unnoticed? How many leads had died on paper because the puzzle was too vast to solve? The Zodiac mocked them in his silence. When the letters slowed and then stopped, investigators were left with emptiness. They had no new words to study, no new crimes to investigate, just the echo of his voice in the archives. It was worse than the letters themselves, because the silence forced them to live with unanswered questions. Some detectives confessed years later that the case followed them home, into their marriages, into their sleep, haunting them with unfinished thoughts. They had been trained to catch killers, to bring closure, but with the Zodiac, closure was impossible. The killer had rewritten the rules. Witness descriptions brought no clarity either. Survivors and bystanders who had seen him offered conflicting portraits. Some described the man with glasses, others swore there were none. Some said he was overweight. Others said average build. Even his height shifted in memory, as though the Zodiac had disguised not only his identity, but his very shape. The police sketches became symbols of uncertainty rather than clarity. People across California stared at the composite drawings and thought they saw their neighbors, their co-workers, their family members. The paranoia spread and suspicion infected communities, making trust a rare and fragile thing. The deeper detectives dug, the stranger the case became. They uncovered connections between the Zodiac's letters and strange works of literature, codes pulled from obscure books, ideas borrowed from military manuals, and puzzles that seemed designed to waste time. Each lead opened a door, but behind the door was only another hallway filled with more doors. Psychologists studied the letters, trying to profile the mind behind them. Was he a genius or just someone who knew how to copy complexity? Was he a loner drifting between towns, or a man with a family hiding his darkness behind suburban curtains? The possibilities were endless, and every theory left more questions than answers. Some officers believed the Zodiac enjoyed the investigation itself more than the killings, that the murders were only fuel for the real performance, which was watching the world spin in confusion around his codes. The killings created fear, but the words gave him immortality. If he had simply killed and vanished, he would have been another murderer lost to time. But by writing himself into history, he ensured that every detective, every journalist, every citizen became part of his stage. He had made himself unforgettable, without ever needing to be seen. The lack of resolution drove wedges not only between police departments, but within them. Detectives accused one another of mishandling evidence, of missing clues, of letting the Zodiac win. Files were lost or misfiled over time, fingerprints smudged, or destroyed, handwriting samples thrown into question. The longer the case dragged on, the more mistakes accumulated, and the further away justice seemed to slip. It was as if the case itself was cursed, destined to remain a wound that could never heal. Retired officers, decades later, spoke of the weight they carried from those years. They remembered the nights when the phone rang with another possible sighting, another potential letter. They remembered the victims' faces etched in photographs on their desks, staring back at them with eyes that seemed to ask why. They remembered the frustration of knowing that someone out there was laughing at their failures. For many, the Zodiac became a shadow that never left, a constant reminder of what it felt like to be defeated. The communities that had lived through the terror never fully recovered either. Even as time passed, the stories remained in whispers, the fear lingered in memories. Couples who had once been teenagers during the killings grew into adults, still haunted by the knowledge that a man had hunted people just like them and never been caught. Parents who had once locked their doors tighter because of his threats carried those habits into old age. The Zodiac had carved himself not only into crime history, but into the very fabric of daily life. Every so often a new theory would emerge, some new piece of supposed evidence pointing in another direction. Each time the old wounds opened again, detectives revisited files, journalists wrote new articles, communities braced themselves for the possibility of truth. But each time the excitement faded when the lead collapsed, leaving behind only more uncertainty. The Zodiac was like a shadow at the edge of vision, always there, but never clear, always close but never caught. For law enforcement, the greatest torment was the feeling that the killer was still out there somewhere, perhaps blending into society, perhaps long dead, but forever beyond their grasp. They had been trained to believe that every crime had an answer, every killer a weakness, but with the Zodiac the answer remained hidden, the weakness never revealed. It was not only the murders that scarred them, it was the unsolvable nature of the man who committed them. The silence of his disappearance was more punishing than the sound of his threats, because silence meant the game could never be won. And then silence descended, as if the phantom who had tormented an entire state simply melted into the shadows and left behind nothing but fear and unanswered questions. For a time the letters slowed, then stopped altogether, and the killings that bore his signature ceased, as if the Zodiac had simply grown tired of his game or had decided he had already won. No one knew if he was dead, imprisoned, living under a false name, or simply content to watch from a distance, while the legend he had carefully constructed grew larger than himself. Silence should have brought relief, but instead it brought unease, because the uncertainty was worse than the presence of his words. People began to wonder whether he had truly stopped or whether he was still lurking, somewhere waiting for another opportunity to strike. The mystery became its own haunting presence, and it was this absence of closure that ensured the Zodiac never faded away. The ciphers remained as his most enduring weapon, symbols that carried the weight of taunts and promises of hidden truths. Some were cracked over the years by skilled amateurs and experts alike, but others resisted all attempts at solving, as though they had been designed only to frustrate and waste time. Each unsolved line of code became like a ghost itself, whispering from the past, daring the living to try again. The letters that were solved revealed a chilling arrogance, a killer who spoke not with regret or fear, but with pride and mockery, claiming ownership of lives stolen and threatening more. The ones left unsolved became an eternal cliffhanger, keeping his name alive in headlines decades after his last known crime. His words stretched across generations, carried from newspaper clippings to documentaries to online forums, where strangers spent countless hours trying to unlock the puzzle that might reveal the face of a ghost. The silence of his disappearance did not erase him, it immortalized him. He became not only a killer, but a myth passed down like folklore that blended history with horror. Parents who had once warned their children of the danger of being out too late passed the story along to grandchildren who had never even been alive during his reign of terror. Each new decade carried fresh obsession, new theories, new suspects, but never a final answer. The Zodiac became a canvas on which fear, paranoia, and curiosity were painted endlessly, a figure who was less a man and more a symbol of the evil that hides in the ordinary. Law enforcement carried the weight of failure, heavier with each passing year. Detectives retired with the case still unsolved, leaving behind boxes of files and the ache of knowing they had not caught the man who mocked them. New generations of investigators picked up the case, hoping modern technology could succeed where older methods had failed. DNA testing, fingerprint databases, handwriting analysis, all were applied to the Zodiac case, but the answers always remained just out of reach. Each false lead reopened old wounds until the frustration became almost as legendary as the killer himself. The investigation turned into one of the most famous unsolved cases in history, not only because of the crimes themselves, but because of the endless search for answers that never came. For the families of his victims, the silence was even crueler. They were denied the closure of knowing who had stolen their loved ones' lives, forced instead to live with endless speculation. Some grew old, waiting for news. Others passed away, never knowing whether justice would ever come. The pain of loss was deepened by the fact that their tragedies were often overshadowed by the killer's theatrics, by the codes and letters that made him famous. Their grief became part of his story, a stage on which he performed and the world watched. The silence of the Zodiac was not peace, it was a wound that never healed. Yet the fascination with the case never dimmed. Writers, filmmakers, journalists, and amateur sleuths all found themselves drawn to the enigma. Each generation rediscovered the Zodiac as though the unsolved nature of the case demanded to be explored again and again. Entire communities of researchers dedicated themselves to cracking the codes, piecing together suspects, and trying to connect the dots that detectives had left behind. The Zodiac's shadow reached far beyond California into the cultural consciousness of America and beyond. He was proof of a terrifying truth, that sometimes evil cannot be neatly contained, that sometimes monsters slip through the cracks and vanish into legend. The codes still haunt America, not only because they remain unsolved, but because they symbolize the larger mystery of the man himself. Who was he really? Was he Arthur Lee Allen, the suspect who seemed to fit, yet never fully matched? Was he an unknown face lost in the noise of thousands of false leads? Was he a man who lived an ordinary life unnoticed by his neighbors, hiding his darkest secrets behind a smile? Or was he already dead before the investigation ever reached its peak? Each theory spawned new debates and new obsessions, but none brought certainty. The Zodiac's identity remains the final unsolved puzzle, a blank space that mocks every effort to fill it. Time has done little to dull his presence. Even now, decades later, the mere mention of his name sends chills down spines and stirs the imagination. His story is retold not because of the number of lives he took, but because of the way he forced himself into the minds of millions, turning fear into his greatest weapon. The silence of his disappearance did not end the nightmare it stretched it out across generations, ensuring that he remained alive in memory. Unlike other killers who faded with their deaths, the Zodiac achieved what he wanted most: to be remembered, to be feared, to live on through the puzzle of his identity. And so the Zodiac Killer remains not just a chapter in crime history, but a question that refuses to be answered. His killings ended, but his shadow never lifted. His letters stopped, but his words still echo. He was not just a murderer, he was a manipulator of minds, a creator of symbols, a puppeteer of fear. His true face may never be known, his real name may never be spoken, but his presence is still here, lingering in the pages of unsolved ciphers and the whispers of those who wonder who he really was. The Zodiac didn't just take lives, he took certainty. And in doing so, he ensured that his legend would never die. Even now, his code still haunts America, a riddle carved in fear, reminding us all that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we never truly see, and the darkest mysteries are the ones that remain unsolved forever.